Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Ed Piscor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Michel Fiffe in the house, man, in living color for a shoot interview today. Got in town yesterday. We went digging in Ides for a couple of hours until they started sweeping up around us.
Yeah,
man,
pretty much. Just vacuuming and cleaning.
High sign that we better make our purchases and get the hell out of there, man. Before we get started, what are some of the things that you picked up at the shop, man? Because we are going back right after the shoot interview, by the way.
Yes, I got to continue my my bin diving, but I got this.
And what is that?
This is a Comics Journal 77 with a cool Kevin Nolan Daredevil cover. So I had to pick that up. I've had it before, but sometimes it doesn't survive my purges.
That's one of those ones you showed it off, and I'm like, oh fuck, I'm so mad you grabbed that one. Like I'm so mad I didn't hit that box before you.
Yeah.
And you were like, there's another one over there.
Yeah.
Scooped it
and
right
now
up,
it's yours. Nolan was supposed to be the artist after Miller. So this is the closest he got to actually fulfilling that promise. But then I think he chose Moon Knight instead, so I don't know.
It's fun seeing his Fantagraphics covers because he largely, beyond color guides, he does the color separations. And
for sure.
When we were down at Heroes Con, one of the conversations we had was about cutting Ben Day for your own color seps, and he was like, you know what, man, the thing that would always suck is when you put your final separations down and you notice a little triangle of dots missing and you can't find it anywhere, and then eventually you just give it up, and then the final printed piece comes out and you see a little pizza slice of extra yellow on top of yellow
somewhere else.
It's a very nerdy conversation.
I love it. Speaking of nerdy, Comic Scene Yearbook. I've never seen this thing. Comic Scene is an old comics magazine that used to be in every bookstore, Walden Books, B. Dalton, stuff like that. It's kind of like the mainstream window into comics. So I always pick them up whenever I can.
Yeah.
And then I got Sinner. And Sinner, for all you listeners, is Jose Munoz's crime comic with writer Sampaio. Yeah. And I never see these in the wild, ever. So I just pick them up automatically. And it was an issue I was missing, so that's fun. And then Escape Magazine, which I'm not too familiar with. I've seen it here and there, but this one also has some Munoz comics in here. And I just can't get enough of Munoz. I wouldn't say he's a huge influence, but I love his work.
Where did you first find his work? Were you a kid?
In my 20s, maybe. Reverse engineering Giffen, pretty much. And that to me, the Giffen Munoz talking point, to me, is the same as like Rob Liefeld feet conversations. It's just hacky. It's just hacky borrowed opinions. It's like it's super cliched, except it's fanboy speak from a snob.
Who's
it's like snobby shit.
A quick summary is that Giffen was criticized for
deeply swiping
some Munoz panels,
which isn't the best practice. People certainly look down upon it. Artists, fans. It's not cool. He just went through a phase. But people just hold on to that phase as if that's like the biggest fuck up, the biggest sin, right?
I mean, the guys calling him out might have been even in that issue of Comics Journal that you were holding.
You're
up
right.
They would have the swipe file and tattletale.
That's right, yeah.
Guys who were cribbing work.
I forget his name, but it was a huge piece. And I think because of that piece, the backlash, that's when Giffen stopped drawing as much and became a layout artist more. Kind of started working for Marvel a little bit, so...
He's lucky that's the days before the internet, man, when a bunch of little armchair guys could hit a couple of buttons on a computer and just never let you forget your transgressions.
Yeah, just a bunch of narcs.
Listen, speaking about social media, I feel like the first time you got put on my radar was the live journal days, man. One of my favorite live journals to follow. I don't think we met before then. I think I was a fan of your live journal. There would be missives and articles in there, blog posts showing off the the fan art, the spot illustrations of the Hernandez Bros before Love and Rockets and Amazing Heroes and Comics Journal, and I'm like, this guy's speaking my language.
Yeah.
This is one of my buds.
It's funny, like live journal, there was a sub-site called Scans Daily, and when I discovered that, people would post like just whole comics sometimes, and they stopped that practice, but I saw it as a way to just share stuff I liked that I didn't see on that site or anywhere. And I would put stuff up like the Hernandez Brothers Comics Journal drawings or old Trevor Von Eden art I'm just like, no one's really talking about these artists, but I love them and I have all this stuff. It was just an avenue for me to sort of share that and just geek out personally. That led to me interviewing Trevor Von Eden, because in me posting stuff about these kind of artists, I was like, what are they doing now? Oh shit, they haven't worked for 20 years. Why is that? Where did they go? What's their story? And I looked for old interviews. They didn't exist. So they're almost erased, right? They're almost like not part of comics history. So just because I needed that information, I sought these people out, and it led to this brief stint of me just talking to these creators,
Yeah.
It didn't last too long, but it's still an interest of mine, but I don't really pursue it as much because of my schedule.
Sure.
But that's how it all started, because of LiveJournal, and that's where I used to post, comics, flyer art. I didn't really use it as a journal, but just as a showcase for art and for stuff I liked. So
that would be in the early 2000s, and that's when I started going to conventions and things. And it was really the first time, Pittsburgh's a pretty small town. I have Jimmy, I have Tom, but wouldn't it be nice to have more friends who speak the same language and things like that? I'd go to shows and meet people like you who totally on the exact same wavelength, but I only get to see you one time a year. And then we go home, and social media cropped up in the midst of that, man. Like MySpace was brand new after the second or third SPX I went to, and then it became a place where, man, not only can I like keep in touch, but I can keep eyes on what the homies are working on. Over these 20 years, it's become perverted into some other shit where it's like I ain't even trying to look at almost anybody's anything, but I'm still looking at what you're doing. I'm looking at those Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the pie charts and shit, just fucking loving every second of it.
That is just me and my obsession. Like I have to create these lists and diagrams just to make sense of stuff. Really no other purpose than that. I really should make a zine out of it because they're piling up. But it could be just really basic, like what's the history of Marvel corporate? Like just like kind of boring stuff that no civilian should ever know these things, right? But in terms of social media, I'm a product of that, and that's how I've built my career, because of the way I distribute my comic and promote my comic and my work. I don't think I'd be able to do that, if it was the 90s or 80s. It would just be a different monster. I'd have to approach it differently, take different avenues in terms of self-distribution, but social media has for sure helped, not only to show art, but just to reach out to people and have that direct contact, because like when I started self-publishing, I wasn't through Diamond, which is the main distributor, right, for comics in this country. I was just doing it on my own, so social media played a huge role in that, As weird as it could get weird, and it's morphed into its own weird thing, but you just got to roll with it, I've learned to do that.
Yeah.
It's one of those tools that is massive because it is a distribution mechanism. And I feel like that's a shift in comics. Like there've been a couple of these seismic distribution shifts, early 80s, late 70s. We have the direct market, which I always point to Love and Rockets is coming out of that. Like the distribution's what enables a book like that.
Yeah.
And I think in this century, like social media has enabled a bunch of different practices, like where you are with Copra, in terms of being really close to your audience, being able to distribute through sort of traditional comic channels and comic stores.
Right.
But it all kind of comes back to that. You were experimenting early on like with webcomics and stuff, like Activate. Were you part of that group? Mm-hmm. So it's almost like if we trace your history, you're sort of trying these different tools that are popping up. Under the umbrella, say, of social media, but you're trying these different pieces, and you can almost see them coming together. What were do you remember any big milestones in like pre-Copra in terms of like, oh, okay, I've hit on a formula here, or I found a way to distribute my work through this mechanism? Do you remember any of those high points?
Yeah, well, that was LiveJournal. Activate was a bunch of cartoonists doing comics on LiveJournal. And to me, that was just another place where I could just put my work, right? So I would do zines, I would go to conventions, I would submit samples, and posting comics online was one of those things that I did to try to break in, right? Just to have some sort of presence, or just see what the feedback would be, whatever. And that morphed, and that was a comic called Panorama, which has since been collected by Dark Horse. And it was weird seeing all those old pages because they're, like 20 years old now at this point, But it helped me develop. I don't know about an audience, because you know what, it was really just a bunch of friends just looking at our own stuff, you know. And so that was good. That was a healthy, good social thing to do and be a part of. And then I did Zegas, and that was also sort of online. And I never saw these comics as web comics, right? I never used it as like, oh, I'm going to take advantage of the web format.
The infinite canvas.
I'm not going to do that. What I was doing is like what I would want to see in print, but it's just online. So it wasn't at its best, in other words, right? To me, the final destination was the print form, where you could flip, you could hold it.
It was great, though, again, in terms of distro. Because, like, that's what would happen to me at shows. I'd come back from shows and there'd be message boards of, like, this is what everybody got at SPX this year. And it'd be, if you missed it, you were kind of out of luck if it was just print. You might be able to track down a copy with the cartoonist, but it was tough if you missed it. If it's online, it's like, okay, I've been hearing about Fiffe. Oh, great, his comic, I can read it here. I can see it all here. And there's such a value in that for somebody who's looking. Sure.
No, there's a value, but what I was mentioning, though, is that it was sort of like just a small crew. It was sort of like preaching to the choir. It was your friends, you know. Some people might have heard of it. You might have seen it. You might have seen it. But it wasn't the world. The potential was there. You know, it's kind of like when a company's like, oh, we'll pay you with exposure. It's like, sure, that's nice in theory, but that ain't shit, right? So when I would post comics online, it would just be, you know, my friends being supportive, which has its value, of course.
It would show up, like the places where it would be shared, because it is that, like, if a tree falls in the forest thing, okay, cool, you guys put this live journal together. Mm-hmm. Where would it show up? It wasn't getting the, like, articles written in Esquire magazine or something for just outsider eyeballs. Right. There's a new link on the Comics Journal message board. Heidi McDonald might put something up on the beat, and that's what you're talking about, right? Like with the preaching to the choir stuff, it's still getting seen by the same comic book heads.
Right, and you're just too busy working on it. You just don't really care. You're just putting stuff out, right? You're hoping it sticks. You're just working. You know, you're just trying to milk those avenues as much as you can. And that led to my self-publishing, because I just didn't want to be online exclusively, you know. And I was also trying to do the traditional mode of breaking in. Like I said, samples, talking to editors, going to conventions with a big, awkward portfolio, getting critiques, being in anthologies, going to shows, not selling zines, pretty much trying to sell zines, trying to sell comics. And it just, all these traditional methods weren't working for me, right? So I was pretty much forced to self-publish, because I just needed my comics to be out there somehow in the way I wanted them to be, not on the web and not through like a company. Like a huge publisher wasn't going to have my work the way I wanted it to be. And that's to say superheroes, right? And that's sort of like the big story of like my career. Not story, but like the arc, which is like juggling the superhero mainstream love and like my own sensibilities, and they don't really mesh well, at least in the eyes of the industry.
Let me ask you this real quick, with that in mind. When you're going to conventions and you're showing editor samples, if you would have gotten a thumbs up, would your style, because it's a very unique style, you're your own guy for sure, would you have morphed into Job Dude? Like, would you have done the thing, man? Like, whatever the du jour...
Well, I don't know.
The deal with the devil.
I don't know, maybe.
I was on that trajectory as a kid before meeting Jim and those guys, like getting out of the Kubert school.
But that's what I wanted to do,
I could have been a penciler.
Yeah.
I could show you those samples.
I was ready for that. And what I was showing editors, it doesn't look like, for example, Copra or anything. I wasn't like doing weird color stuff or weird layouts. I was trying to do the traditional thing. Like, I could draw. I want to tell stories. Let me get in there, and then I start doing my shit, right? Then I start...
The Rob formula.
Exactly, right. I grew up taking those guys' advice, right? You redraw an old comic, or not an old, but any comic, just redraw it, show it how you would do it. And I thought I could do it, you know? Ever since high school, I was like, yeah, I could do this. This is my career. This is what I want. This is what I want my career to be. But I also knew about Love and Rockets. I also knew about 8-Ball. I knew about every cartoonist that's in that Comic Book Confidential documentary. I knew about the world outside of Marvel, DC. I wasn't a dumb kid, but I wanted to have a career. Like, I knew that. I wanted to get paid to make comics. So And I grew up wanting to draw Batman and, you know, X-Men and everything. I just wanted to be that guy. Essentially like a Frank Miller sort of, or John, you know, all the guys that worked in that industry where they just plugged away on these huge characters and then they went off and did Sin City, right? That to me seemed like a sound model, and I wanted to do that. So pretty much have my cake and eat it too. Do superheroes, but do it in your own way, and then do your own thing anyway. Or even Image Comics, that's the way it was. It's like, I'm going to do Spider-Man for a few years, and then I'm going to do Spawn. To me, it just seemed logical. So that's always been the struggle, and I think when I was trying to break in, I don't know, it just wasn't working. It just wasn't good. It was a time in the industry when like people weren't hiring. Like you had to be really fucking either great or you have to fit into Ohio's style. And I don't think my style was like great at all, but there was no room for development. I wasn't like a crusty bunker. I wasn't a Ramita Raider. I wasn't in there. I should have been an intern. That should have been my way in. Would I have turned out the way I am now? Probably not, but who knows, you know? I still would have wanted to do my own thing. That's always been in me, to make my own comics, but also like, yeah, I want to work on these huge properties to make my own stuff happen.
Are you still interested in that? Working on these huge properties? Is that still some part of the plan?
It's not part of the plan. It's just, well, it's gravy, right? It's like if I get those gigs, awesome, I'll do them. I'm not above that. Like I haven't like divorced myself from that part of the industry, but it's not like plan A or plan B. Like I got my own comics to make, you know.
You mentioned G.I.Joe and Bloodstrike, or you mentioned
you reminded me of those. Yeah.
Those are a really interesting piece because, you know, you bookend them on both sides with Copra. So you bookend them on both sides with your own work and self-published and Image and all this stuff. What was the experience with those? Was that a positive experience, doing work for hire?
Well, I got to say, that was, okay, so just to skip ahead a little bit, when I did Copra, which is, you know, my serialized adventure comic, I started getting work from Marvel as a writer, which was weird for me. Like at first I thought they wanted me to draw because I don't see myself as a writer. I'm like an artist first, or cartoonist really, but if I had to do a job like that, it would have to be art. But they wanted a writer. So
what era was this Bill Jemas era?
No, this was
Axel?
2013, 2014.
Okay. I just asked that because I remember Bill Jemas, he called me up one time after WYSIWYG, and they were starting something new up. And he all but said, I think your art sucks, but I would love for you to do some writing for us. And I wondered if you got that same conversation. Anyhow, go ahead.
I'm sure that's the opinion behind closed doors. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know. They eventually let me draw. They let you draw, so it's all good. It worked out. Yeah. No, this was 2013, 2014. The first year of Copra was wrapping up, and Brian Michael Bendis reached out. He was a fan, and he was like, would you like to work on something? Are you open to that? And I'm like, sure, of course, whatever it is. What is it, you know? Next thing I know, it's for a writing gig. So I did that, right? And then I started getting more writing gigs or more writing offers, and it just wasn't fun.
Yeah.
You know, I tried it. I got outside of my comfort zone. It was good. I have no horror stories about it. You know, the people I worked with were cool, the editors.
Were you going Giffen with it, providing layouts, just drawing comics on type and paper?
The first issue of the title I worked on, All New Ultimates, I provided some layouts, you know, some choreography, right? And I was like, oh, that'll be my stamp, right, my visual stamp. But it didn't work. First of all, it was for free, too. It was like, oh, they're not paying me for layouts.
Right.
So I'm not going to do this extra work, this extra thinking, when it's going to be sort of ignored anyway. It's not going to look the way I laid it out. So it's like, you know what? Let's just, you do the art, I'll do the writing. That's it.
That was going to be a question. Did it look the way you planned at the end?
No.
I feel like you got to divorce yourself completely. Like you just can't, as a writer, you can't even look at that stuff. It's never going to be, especially if you draw, you can't.
Yeah.
Don't even.
No, it was weird.
That way.
I'm glad I went through that experience, but it was weird. It took a lot. And I got to say, there was at one point in the process when pages started coming in where it was kind of cool.
I know what you mean, yeah.
It was like, oh shit, this guy's drawing, you know, these, you know, and when the pages would be colored, these pages are coming back and it's like, oh shit, yeah, that's what I wrote. That's kind of neat. That's neat. I could see how that's like thrilling to people and you just do that forever, right? But I wanted to get away from that. It was like, oh, I'm being cast as like a writer. I'm like, I got to be a cartoonist. So then I stopped, I stopped doing writing work for all these companies. I'm like, okay, the next thing, not to say rebrand, but it was like that. In the eyes of the editors, I had to project something else. It's like, you got to take the whole package or nothing, right? And there was a break in Copra coming up one of those years. I think it was 2017 or 2018, because at that point I did Copra in 6-issue arcs. There was a break coming up. I was like, well, who's going to pay me to do that? Who's going to pay me to write and draw and color and letter, which a lot of companies don't like hand lettering, right? For whatever reason. And IDW was the company. They wanted to do something with a property, right? There was an editor I was talking to, and I asked about Ninja Turtles first. I'm like, what is the property that I could work on that I love, that I know I'm familiar with? And they're like, oh, that's unavailable. How about G.I. Joe or Transformers? I'm like, we'll take G.I. Joe. I know G.I. Joe some, But then the negotiations took so fucking long that I'm like, I need work. I need a page rate soon. Hasbro's sleeping on it. So I just text Rob Liefeld with like, hey, I would love to do Bloodstrike. And I pitched it, and he greenlit it. And it's like, oh yeah, so that's awesome that, it took Rob Liefeld to like make that happen. Like, gave me the keys to his kingdom, so to speak, where I could do whatever I wanted in whatever manner I wanted. And he dug it, he made it happen. So it was a positive experience, like 100%. After that, though, Hasbro came around, and they're like, okay, you can do G.I. Joe now. But I was already like spent. I was spent on Bloodstrike because I gave Bloodstrike my all. So I approached G.I. Joe differently. It wasn't the same thing. It was a different project, different tone, different dynamics. Still a group team, because that, I kind of typecast myself in that. It's like doing team books. But one of them was an extreme 90s property. The other was like kind of an 80s cartoon property. So I had to approach those differently. But they're both good. I couldn't wait to get back to Copra. And I wouldn't be able to do that all the time, like jumping from one thing to the next and developing pitches and like playing the waiting game, hoping that someone likes what I did. And that's kind of how Copra was created to begin with. Just like, could you imagine DC giving me Suicide Squad? Like, that's just never going to happen. But I needed that to happen. Like, I needed to be that guy that I took that property and do my own thing with it. But that wasn't ever going to work within corporate parameters, especially in that year, especially, post New 52. That was a different company from the one I grew up with. The company had changed, the industry had changed since when I expected to break in, So that's how Copra was born.
Since you're the self-publisher of Copra, you must, have eyeballs on new readership, peaks and valleys, things like that. Mm-hmm. Did you notice a change in readership? Did it move the needle when you were working on these work-for-hire gigs? Did you create new Copra readers?
Not for Marvel.
Well, how about...
Not for Marvel, but for
Bloodstrike and G.I. Joe?
For Bloodstrike, for sure. Like, Bloodstrike fans, Rob Liefeld fans, they were super supportive. And they've become Copra readers since. And subscribers, and they buy the books, and they buy the merch, and they're super cool. They're super nice. I like engaging with them. The G.I. Joe audience, a little bit, maybe a fraction of the Bloodstrike audience. Yeah, and they're fine too. That audience is like its own world.
It is, yeah.
All these properties have their own little worlds and gangs. That they don't really interact. So you got the X-Men audience. Right, like I got the Bloodstrike audience. Sometimes they cross over, sometimes it doesn't.
One of the real interesting pieces when Tom was doing the Transformers G.I. Joe, like he identified like two separate, like from a distance at shows, he could tell if a guy was coming up, if it was a Transformer dude or if it was a G.I. Joe cat. Like they're two tribes unto themselves. Was Savage Dragon the first print stuff? The issue that 160 or whatever?
Yeah. Oh, that was
pretty early. That was
in pre-Zegas. I was in the middle of Zegas, actually, but I hadn't self-published yet.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the Twisted Savage Dragon Funnies thing. That actually started with Spawn. Todd wanted to do a Bizarro Stories, Strange Tales type of thing with Spawn. And I pitched it and then heard nothing, like he abandoned the idea. And the guy who brought it to me, I was like, that's a great idea. Why don't you do something with it, you know? And he's like, nah, Todd doesn't want to do it, whatever. I mentioned it to Eric Larson, whose contact I had. And I'm like, why don't you do this with Savage Dragon? That'd be cool. Hoping that he would be like, yeah, maybe you could do one. Cool. Maybe I could get like a cool like 8-pager in the back of Savage Dragon. You know, that would be a dream. I love Savage Dragon. And he's got a good, rich history of having cool backups and cool features in every issue. Eric Larson was like, go for it. I'm like, what do you mean go for it? He's like, run the thing if you make it happen. So I did. You know, he was just like, yeah, produce this stuff for a whole year. We'll give you backups for a whole year. You could do one, have your friends do one, whatever. And that's what I did. I contacted all my comic book buddies pretty much to work for free, just to work for, again, exposure. Right. And they came through, man. They came through. And that's how it started, my print Savage Dragon. Right, but I was still doing web comics, but that was like a major print milestone for me.
Yeah.
So eventually that was collected. I remember driving to Baltimore that year, like after the series had begun, and in hopes of getting a collection of like kind of pitch it to Larson. As soon as I walk up to his table, he's like, hey, the backups are great. Maybe we could do a collection. I'm like, awesome. You just saved me that conversation. Great idea, Eric. That's awesome. So he greenlit that, and that's when I was like, well, I got to get other people on it, like people that, you know, would do me a solid and make a cool comic. There's no money, but whatever. And, you know, Tom did a story. You and Jason Lex did a story, you know. It was great. It was cool. It was a cool book, but you know that's an under the radar title to begin with, Savage Dragon. You know, so it was almost like a blip. Like we were trying hard. We promoted it. We did signings. We did the best we could with what we got. You know, but that was a good learning curve. That was me like wrangling a bunch of people. It was sort of like a low key editing. You know, I mean, I would edit some of those stories if something came back and it just didn't make too much sense. I would try to shape it a little bit. I would suggest things. Other people just do your own thing, whatever, you know. So it was sort of an interesting step for me. And I kind of did that at Bloodstrike too. You know, I did that with like with Bloodstrike, in that the way Image works, it's that you get 20 pages, you get paid for the 20 pages of story, right? And then there's back matter, and I just didn't want there to be ads. So I asked a bunch of people, like, do you want to do a pinup, do a fake pinup or a story or whatever, and just filled it, you know, just filled it to the brim with just cool shit that I just wanted to see.
You made good on not inviting me to do Savage Dragon by letting me do that Dutch piece. I was on that Harvey Picard tip at that time, too. I was so jealous of Tom and Jimmy, like, man, I want to do a Savage Dragon.
I had those... I had your minis from back then. The super stippled, fucking crazy.
I was the run of the litter, man, like, super.
Also, I didn't know you. I knew you.
Yeah.
I think I met you at a Mocha once.
I don't remember how we met, man. I was trying to think about.
Must have been at a show. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea about like the first time. It's definitely online stuff before meeting in person.
Yeah, but I had that mini where you were in a straitjacket.
Yeah.
And I'm like Drew Friedman level, like fucking like insane shit. And then the Harvey stuff, of course. But yeah, that Savage Dragon stuff, I hold that stuff fondly. You know, I like that period of comics, but it's so different now. Like I would never ask anyone to work for free. Like, you know, I'll pay it's not much, but I'll pay something worth your time. But back then, I don't know. I'm glad I went through it, you know.
What year was that? Because I feel like that's right before comics kind of start to really kind of come out of that late 90s, early 2000s.
It's 2009, 2010. Because I started Zegas around 2000, late 2010.
Yeah, I feel like there's a real Image renaissance in, like, I don't know, 2012, 2013, where I remember looking around at What Am I Gonna Do? And it's like, man, they're publishing single-issue comics, good single-issue comics again. Like, there was a real energy around it. But it felt like that had not been there for a while. And I think Savage Dragon Twisted Funnies comes out sort of at the end of that dark period of, like, I don't know, not a big readership or not a lot of interest, not a lot of media coverage,
right.
That kind of stuff.
Right.
And then it had started turning around, and at that point it feels like the industry starts this upward trajectory.
Hey man, I was working on Zegas and I pitched it to Image and it didn't work. Yeah, I pitched Zegas everywhere.
Was that Larson publisher at that time?
No, it was Stevenson.
Okay.
But Larson still, you know, he has I don't know if he has say. I wouldn't frame it as such, but I had done the Savage Dragon funnies, so I was familiar with everyone somewhat. So I'm like, oh yeah, this is a sort of in, you know. It's not locked in, it's not like in the bag or anything, but they passed on it, and that's fine. But that's why I had to self-publish, because I'm like, I have all this material and I want to continue doing it. And it's just not fair to the readers or myself to have this stuff only online. I wanted to have the print edition. You know, I really, before I quit comics or before whatever I did, I needed to do something my way, right? And that's why I started self-publishing.
Let's talk about that for the back half of our conversation. The Zegas stuff that you published, off the bat, it was sort of the same technical setup as Copra was, like really handsome paper, oversized, chunky paper, like a extremely good quality product. I can't think of anything else that had that sort of tactility to it. And you're such a comic head. You know what I mean? Like the stuff we're going to be talking about today, it's very mainstream, floppy. You know, it fits in a bag and board. So my question is about the impetus of all of that stuff, like the format, the paper. It's so different than standard comics.
Well, the format that I loved also, other than the standard traditional comic book size, was the magazine size, the Love and Rockets Fantagraphics format, the very first 50 issues. I just love that format. I love it. And so that's what I decided to do Zegas on, because the Panorama thing on LiveJournal, that was just standard comic size. So I wanted to try something different. And that's when I started incorporating color into my work, right? So little by little, just a few colors here and there, nothing too crazy.
Which, by the way, even at that time, color book, like, I feel like color was still expensive then.
Yeah.
And especially on a self-publishing level.
Right.
Because that was my coming out of that background of like, if you're going to do indie comics, they're black and white.
It's got to be black and white. Maybe gray tones, right? Forget wash. Like, wash will look weird. You run the risk of it looking really muddy.
Straight up Aircell Comics kind of gimmicks.
And those are markers, and I mean, whatever. You just run a risk, right? So because of technology being what it was at that point, I was able to produce something pretty cheap, affordable for me, full color at magazine size with that specific paper, which I worked with the printer who was pretty patient with me.
Was it in New York?
No, they're in Canada.
Okay.
What's it called? Avenue 4. I don't know if they're still around. I think they're still around. I don't work with them anymore. I jump from printer to printer just to test out different things. It's always different. But back then, I remember they sent me a copy, and it was super glossy, like a proof sort of what they wanted, what they were going to do. And I was so terrified. I'm like, no. Is there anything we could not do this? So I would send them, I don't know, samples. I would try to talk to them. They would send me little samples and strips and stuff. And we landed on what I used in Zegas. And it looked great. I thought the colors really popped. It was sturdy. It would survive the mailing system. I just wanted a cool artifact, just a cool item for someone to hold. As much as I love those old comics, I wanted something that would stand out a little bit, you know. But then when it came to Copra, I combined it. I combined that sensibility with a standard format, size, page count, stuff like that. So I don't know. I just always liked that high-end stuff, that almost like quasi-prestige format, raw magazine, sort of like, I just like that attention to quality.
Did you have any reservations going to superheroes with Copra?
I wouldn't say reservations, but at that point, because I wasn't gaining any traction, breaking into the big two, or even just side little gigs through IDW or whatever, I would send samples to everybody. And I was just doing indie stuff, for lack of a better term. You know, I'm like, okay, I guess I'm an indie guy. I don't see my style as an indie guy. It's just the way I draw. But if I'm indie, whatever, right? So I thought doing Copra was... I didn't know if anyone would like it, because I was so conditioned to think, oh yeah, those two things belong in separate places. Superhero, adventure, genre stuff, and whatever it is you do, right? The way you draw, the way you ink, the way you present shit, like, it's just very different. They're not compatible. And like I said earlier, I think that's just the main thrust of my entire, not only this project, but my entire career, is just me trying to combine those things. Me trying to be like me trying to resist and fight the fact that superheroes don't have to be limited. They don't have to look a certain way. It's actually the opposite. They could look like anything, but and I get it, it's led by commercial considerations. Things sell, things don't. Editors think this sells, this doesn't, you know.
I think it's led by nostalgia of two giant corporate companies in this country. You know, the superhero
in a big way,
popularity.
Sure. Yeah.
And that may have changed in the last decade or two, but I mean, that's what we grew up reading the same comics because they dominated distribution and publishing and everything, and it was like the one genre. The reason that I asked you about the superhero stuff is because you're a similar age of us. Mm-hmm. We grew up when there was a divide of alternative comics and superheroes, that's and right. It was like almost at odds with one another. You
that's
know,
right.
You were one or the other.
You couldn't like both.
And that's really changed. And really in our careers, that has really changed where it's like, yeah, you can bring it all in. Like there's no divide anymore. There's not like two groups, although like you say, there might be 100 groups now.
Yeah.
But you know, I knew people that struggled with that. You know, I knew people like us who had grown up as superhero fans, but it was almost like a dirty secret if you still enjoyed those or if you read any superhero comics.
Right. If you were an indie guy, remember, it was cool if you liked Kirby. Mm-hmm. You got that much leeway. Like, all right, we'll allow Kirby to be celebrated. Not Frank Miller. Definitely not the Image guys.
Definitely not.
That is garbage.
Us. That's us. I think it was like, started with the Kirby stuff. Then you had like the comics where they would talk about the color techniques of Neil Adams and Kevin Nolan, talk a little Howard Chaykin. It started to bleed a little bit more. Yeah. But it would almost be like what the old timers that we would interview, they would talk about ground level comics, or like, you know, like American Flag. It's like superhero adjacent books or whatever. And at this point now, I feel like our crew, like, it's not like you get to decide what area you're in or who you're identified with, but I would say that the three of us and maybe 7 or 8 other dudes really represent an era or something. I don't want to say the word movement because it's not like we're trying to do anything. Mm-hmm.
Well, we just have those influences.
We fucked with before. We were the children of the speculator market.
Yeah.
We were there at the start of Image. And we were there for 8-Ball and Acme Novelty Library. Like, we are the kids who grew up with both and see sort of no difference.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. You know, recently I've been thinking about my trajectory and trying to break in, you know, not to look back too much, but I'm like, okay, what did I do wrong? What happened, right? And I think I know. It's not that I had thin or thick skin. I think it's just when I would show my stuff to like an editor and they'd be like, well, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. I wouldn't go back and try to fix those things. I would be like, well, he just doesn't understand. I'm just going to do my own indie, crazy, artsy shit. Fuck superheroes, right? So then I would go and start drawing my own weird, you know, esoteric type of just kind of nonsense, thinking that was art, thinking, oh, this is my indie shit, right? And I would submit it to the companies. And when they would turn it, they'd be like, what is this, you know? Once that didn't hit, I'm like, fuck art and fuck the indies. I'm going to do superhero because that's a job and that's, you know, I could make sense of that. That's a career. I could take steps and I would do more superhero samples and I would get those criticisms, but I didn't fix those criticisms. I would just go back to indies. So it was like this ping pong match of like, I'm not learning anything. I'm in this weird loop where I'm too thick-headed and proud to improve. So I think I just improved just by fact that I just kept doing it, but I didn't really take any advice from either side. I think to my detriment, you know, I think I could have gotten to where I'm at quicker had I listened, had I had either a mentor or school. You know, I never went to school. You know, we were talking about school earlier and it's like, I never had someone to be like, all right, cut this shit. You really want to do this? You got to sit down and fix the things that you're getting wrong, you know. Or to do art in a certain way. If you're going to do indie, just really shape your vision. Don't just put shit out there. Just really, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to do? And I think, cut to Copra, that's me reconciling both. Hopefully in a way that's entertaining to people.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine you getting there sooner by following somebody's feedback because stylistically your stuff is so unique. You know, if you were going to move more towards getting work at Marvel, DC, IDW, It would have meant shaving certain stylistic ticks off,
Sure.
probably. And same with going through like a school program or working underneath someone. You know, like all of those things would, in a way, I think, rob what Copra is.
It would have been different, certainly. But then I just think the proof is in guys like Walt Simonson or Sam Keith. Those, and maybe Walt is weird because Walt, like I fucking know him. Mr. Simonson. He's an anomaly because he's a fan favorite, but he's so weird, right? Really, he's just, if you compare it to like what was in context, it's so fucking weird. Sam Keith, again, like how did that guy get a job, right? Compare, you know, when you think about like editorial being so conservative, how did that guy get through?
I know 100% what you're saying, because I remember buying Sam Keith's Hulk fill-in and just being like, how did this get, what is this?
What happened?
I never saw
and it just got
like
more intense and weirder, and I'm like, yeah, so you can make a career out of this. It is possible. And I just kept that. Even McFarlane, as popular as he was, that stuff is weird. Yep. That stuff is unorthodox for sure. And it just got popular. So it's almost like, oh yeah, I don't have to draw like a specific house style. I could just do my own thing. Just let me get in there. Let me break in. But I wasn't savvy enough to do that, and I didn't have a mentor or someone to really guide me. Maybe for the best. It worked out the way it was supposed to, right? It's just me thinking about that. Just me thinking about like, damn, I have all these all those years of like trying to make inroads, and it just didn't work. So it's just interesting to me. It's, you know, I don't regret anything, but it was just kind of funny.
Explain this sort of, because you're doing everything down to the distribution of Copra.
Correct? Yeah.
By and large.
At least the issues.
The issues,
yeah,
right.
I've never distributed the collections ever.
So explain that period of time, and specifically that first run of Copra where you were trying to do that shit monthly, and certainly at a greater frequency. What was that process like per issue? How many weeks or so were spent in production, putting the pages together, working with printers, and having boxes shipped to your apartment and sending that stuff out? Because I know that that's a couple of days at least.
Yeah, it was intense, but I just broke it all down to days. You know, I had X amount of days to do every job. To write, I better get that script done in 2 days. I better do layouts in a day or two, maybe. Pencil, you know, it was all broken down very specifically. And I had to get it done because every issue to me meant rent. It wasn't like a vanity project that, just come out whenever, you know. I was paying rent. I made enough money from one issue to pay for the print run for the next issue and to pay my rent, you know, to pay utilities and stuff and other bills. You know, you do an illustration here, you just something. Yeah, you sell some art, yeah. But the issues were rent money to me for that first year, for sure. And then after I did the one solid year of just monthly comics, that's when it was like the Marvel writing gig, and it's like it all kind of like cooled off. I could do that. I could work with, you know, Joe Casey on a couple Captain Victory pages. I could do a Daredevil short story. I could do a little bit. So I was okay, I'm paying my bills making comics. This wasn't just a fluke, right? Like it worked. Like I ran the risk of that 1 year. I'm like, okay, I'm going to dedicate a year to do this one thing, see if it works. And to be honest, I didn't know if it would go past the third issue because I had no idea what it was going to turn into. You know, I thought I could have burnt out. I could have just not had stories to tell. I could have just devolved into something. But to me, it was like, oh yeah, this is what I've always wanted to do. So it was just a natural sort of thing. The schedule just kind of like locked me into it. I had to do it. And I had a subscription. And it was only a few people, but people that paid money for the subscription for 12 issues. It was a whole, I'm like, or 11 because it started on issue 2. But I'm like, oh man, I can't give that money back. You know, like I gotta produce the work. I gotta produce these books.
I don't think they give the money back. We talk all the time about these indies that are like, here, buy the subscription, and it's like one issue was published ever.
It's so cool that you made good on your commitments with that stuff. And in those earlier days when you were doing that first round, I seem to remember stories not from you but from roommates, housemates, who would say that like when that box of books is supposed to show up, like you are at the window like a puppy dog, like waiting for The shit to show up.
Oh yeah.
Because then it's time to put on distributor cap.
Yeah.
And start filling envelopes.
I mean, I was on pins and needles waiting for that truck from Canada to ship whatever copies. I started with 300, 400 copies, which ain't shit, but it's a lot for me. It's all I could actually physically accommodate in my studio.
Yeah.
And sell to stores and sell to subscribers and maybe post a couple extra copies on Etsy and sell them individually. But that's how it started, working with the printer, but also, and they were easy to work with, but also just having the room and the space to just create the pages. I didn't have a job at the time. That was my job. That was the risk involved. I was working before at a costume design puppet shop in the city, and I had been there for 7 years. I'm like, yeah, it's time to go. So I had to really focus on comics and see if that worked or not, because before I was trying to do it the same way we all do, just have that side gig, but really it's comics what we want to do in hopes of breaking in. That's my version of breaking in, because before it was only like little jobs here and there, and that wasn't enough. Self-publishing Copra, putting it out, making good on those subscriptions, having the goodwill of the stores and the readers, and just building and building and building, I think that helped.
I tell you, at the time, I think we had done a show in Philly and ran into you right about the time that you were launching maybe issue 1.
The Locust Moon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was following your work. I had known you for years at that point, and it seemed like a really radical concept. I'm going to self-publish, I'm going to distribute, I'm going to do all this stuff myself, a color book. Were you looking at were you talking to other self-publishers like a Jeff Smith or Dave Lapham, Dave Sim, any of these people that had self-published? Because it's pretty rare what you're doing.
I didn't talk to anybody. But I felt like I could manage it. It was only a couple hundred copies of this thing. I could manage that, and it slowly grew and grew. And by that time, I just had been accustomed to the rhythm of handling the boring aspect, the grind of the managerial aspect of self-publishing, following invoices and supplies and scheduling, whereas I just really wanted to draw. And that's why I resisted self-publishing for years, even though the guys like Dave Sim and all those guys, they made it work, but I just didn't want to do that. I wanted someone to do it for me. I wanted a Gary Groth to just let me go wild, right? Someone to take care of the business. I didn't talk to anybody. No, I remember talking to you at that show, and it was like the second issue. I had just gotten the second issue delivered, and it was still so fresh and new. It was so weird. I think I just went by the adrenaline rush of just having stuff produced. I know nothing beats that. Like to this day, even just having the book show up and having it in print, that's like it for me. It's so good.
So, you mentioned a couple hundred copies of those. It's enough to pay rent. You can't even pay utilities with it. And there's enough to seed the next issue. Kind of a head trip is it, man? Well, you see that those first issues go for $500-$600 on eBay.
Yeah, I wish I would have kept some copies, right?
Could maybe do a bootleg set.
Yeah, I could do something like that. That is a weird aspect of it that, of course it's flattering, but it's also just that collector aspect of the industry. And I'm like, I had no idea that would even make a mark, because if people don't give a shit, those would be worthless.
Right.
You could have 100 copies or 50 copies of something, but if no one's looking for it, then who cares? And that's what my comics were before.
Yeah.
Right? So I was pretty lucky in that regard, I don't really see a dime off of that. It's just it's just like bragging points, I guess, or bragging rights, but whatever, If people collect the way they collect, right? I can't control that. I used to try to do that, right? Because people would try to buy 5 or 10 copies, and I had to limit it, 1 per customer. Because I'm like, I just want people to read it. If you're a dude buying 5 or 10 copies to then flip it on eBay, fuck off, right? But I had to get my head out my own ass, because I'm like, you know what? Let them buy. I'll just print more, whatever. Let them do what they do, I guess, whatever.
Did you have a moment where you're like, this is working? Was there, I don't know, selling out issue 3 or selling subscriptions or having to put a compendium together? Was there a moment where you're like, okay, this is the system's in place, the response is as good or better than hoped.
You know, maybe when the compendium happened, I think I did get my Gary Groth by way of Tucker Stone and Tom Adams, co-owners of Bergen Street Comics. They're my local shop, and they were good friends. And they kind of experimented with putting out a compendium of the first 3 issues that sold out quickly, right? And I was out, and I couldn't print more. And they're like, well, what if we just collect it, and it'll just be a cool item? You know, there's been a history of stores getting into print, you know. At that point, you know, Desert Island and Floating World had done stuff, so it was just natural that Bergen Street would kind of like do something cool, right? And I was honored to be subject to that, right? To be the person that they chose, right? And it worked, and those things flew off the shelf. Like, those are great. And so I think a big part of the success of Copra was that the word of mouth, and because of Bergen Street Comics, like really pushing it, you know, because that gave it that like kind of like that cool novelty, you know, thing where it's like, ooh, this store's doing what now? Like, what are they putting out? So it's like a bunch of different set of eyes on Copra, and I got a readership out of that, you know. So I got my old readership, some new people, the Bergen Street people. It all kind of like came together to create like this sort of momentum that has served me since, you know. So they were super valuable in the success of Copra, for sure. They eventually went from a few compendiums to actually releasing the books. Bergen Street Comics became an actual publisher, and they started producing the 6-issue collections. Then they went on to produce, you know, Chuck Forsman's comics.
Those collections were really nice. I remember picking up the collection, and I had the original comics, picking up the collection and being like, oh, I have the comics, I don't need this, until I picked one up and was like, oh, this is really nice. Beautiful paper and everything.
Yeah.
Like, they did a really great job with it too. And I think that helps. You know, because especially when it comes to books, like, that's a real thing, picking it up and seeing how it feels, you know, and seeing what it looks like on the actual paper that was chosen and stuff. Yeah. And that's about as good production-wise as any book I can think of.
For sure. And Tom and Tucker, they had their own sensibilities. They had an editorial point of view, whether they admit that or not. They just had taste. They had their own taste, is what I'm saying. They knew what they liked, they knew what they didn't, and they walked it, you know. Right, and I think the store is a version of that. The way they curated the books that they sold, and the way they presented themselves, that's what set them apart. And they just applied that to my book. So I just benefited from that, you know, because I had my own sensibilities for the issues, very specific details that I wanted, different specific paper stock. The collections are different, and I'm all for that. I want every edition to kind of be different, have its own identity. So. Yeah, I miss them. I miss Bergen.
Because now Image does handles the collections.
Yeah, well, Bergen shut its doors, and so I needed a home, and Image was the natural fit. Because Image was actually, they were going to be the original publisher of Copra, but I had to make a decision. I'm like, well, are you guys going to become a publisher? Or do I go to Image? And that's when they decided, okay, we're going to release the books. And so I just, out of loyalty, and because I just dug what they did, I'm like, okay, Bergen Street all the way, until they weren't a concern anymore. And so I'm like, okay, well, maybe Image will take it now, you know. But I still got to do the single issues somewhat. But then at that point, I'm trying to remember, that's when I wanted to stop self-publishing, because I was just burnt out, you know, after like 31 issues. I was just like, I need a break. If Image collects the books, maybe they could start doing the issues as well. And so that lasted for about 6 issues until I just got back to self-publishing, essentially. So it was an experiment, you know.
Dude, you did the Jeff Smith gimmick. You got to give it a shot and see what happens. I think it's important for longevity to check other avenues.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. In the spirit of sort of trying new things, I'm like, why not? And it worked. I got some new readers out of it. The books do well, continue to do well. So
I always think like one of the great things of owning your own comics is that you get to you can have it online, you can do the comic book version, you can do the deluxe edition, the collections, all these things. And the way you've set up Copra, it's like those things are really unique entities. You know, like what Image is doing is very different than if somebody is buying issues from you.
Yes.
And that's kind of cool. It's almost the maximum version of that. Like how how unique can you make each one of these formats that you're choosing to put your material into?
Yeah. And now that they're doing the first 12 issues, the huge, my first hardcover in the States, I wanted that to look different too. It's going to be oversized. It's going to be on a different kind of paper, like a little grittier. It's just going to be a cool thing. I'm super excited to see it.
We should end on that note, man. When is that book hitting the shelves?
It's coming out November 16th, right before the holidays really hit. So that was weird. That was cool because it was weird in that I had to look at old issues, the first 12 issues. I try to never read my stuff unless I'm referencing like a plot detail or a costume detail. And reading that stuff is just, I don't know. It was fun. It's so far removed from what I do now, I feel like, aesthetically, or just the way I think about comics. Not too removed, but it's different enough where it's like I could appreciate it and not like judge it too harshly, right?
It's like 10 years, man. That's a different person, especially
I know.
With your productivity.
I know.
I had one more thing I wanted to ask you about. Like, prepping for this interview, one thing that came up in my mind, the idea of fan fiction and nostalgia. And I don't know how much you think about those two things, if you think they, are a major part of your work or not, if you have positive or negative thoughts on them. But did you have any thoughts on that subject and how it relates to the work you make?
Well, first of all, that's about fan fiction. That was sort of like the taboo aspect of Copra, right? Where it's like, oh, it's just fan fiction, right? It's just, that's what it is, sort of. You could make a case for that, whether it be pro or con. It was sort of like, oh, this indie guy's making like superhero fan fiction. If you want to frame it like that, you can. And I guess technically it could be, but I didn't really think about it. I had no idea 50 Shades of Grey was fan fiction.
That kind of talk, that's fan talk.
It just doesn't matter to me. Yeah.
Like you're a maker of things.
Right.
And you're a fan of comics.
If you just follow, if you follow that logic, it's like, well, Marvel Comics has been fan fiction since the day Kirby left.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that doesn't matter. It's almost like the term, like, it's like selling out isn't a term that really means much these days. It's such a different world. The conditions are so different that's just a dated concept almost. Or it just means something different. And in terms of, I don't know, in terms of nostalgia, it's different because people really get like an 80s vibe or 90s vibe from some of my stuff. But I don't really replicate anything from the 80s. Like the paper stock, the way I ink, the way I write, the whole Copra thing is not really 80s centric. I'm not really out to like replicate a thing, right? So it's just a feeling that people have. Maybe it's a subscription.
One could argue, and it's maybe because I've been reading Comics Journal interviews, but one could argue that the entire format of the comic book is a nostalgic format.
Maybe. I mean, so the reason I chose Copra to be a specific format, it was because the industry standard.
Yeah.
It was that format. I was like, okay, so comics are 20 pages at that point. I'll make it 24. They have tons of ads. I'll put no ads in there. But I wanted it to be in that format so you could bag and board it. No retailers could complain about the size because, some retailers could, complain about like, it's too big. It doesn't fit the shelves. It doesn't fit the boxes. All right, I'll make it easy on you. I'll make it standard size. That's why it's serialized. That's why it uses, it's a superhero story. So all those conventions I used to my advantage, but that's part of the makeup of it, So I don't think it's because it's nostalgic, because the size is still the same. The production might be a little higher, but I just don't think nostalgia plays too much into it. Maybe it does. Maybe it's too baked into what I like, and it comes out in the work, and maybe people read into it. But I just never consciously do it. It's not a thing. It's not a bad or good thing. It just, the only time I tried to actually actively replicate something is for Bloodstrike. I wanted something shinier. I wanted to mimic the letters pages. That's why the pinups were kind of like faux ads. I'm like, that is me trying to replicate something very specific. And just for that, for Copra, it was like, I'm just using the industry standards, the status quo details to create this thing my way. But I don't know, yeah, maybe nostalgia is a part of it. It's not an active ingredient, as far as I know. I don't know. Also, the fact that I'm working on characters that are tied to a different era, though, might be it,
And I didn't, just for the record, like fan fiction, something I think of some of my work as fan fiction. Certainly the Hulk was all fan fiction in my mind. I have no negative connotation about that. I just think as we move into this world where we're basically on our own, I think in the American comics industry for the most part, there's not a lot of editorial input, especially in self-publishing. It is different than going through, say, a Marvel or a DC editorial system.
Yeah.
And it is really, in the way 50 Shades of Grey might be fan fiction, it kind of is fan fiction in that one person can do it, and then it's direct to the consumer and let the chips fall where they may, based on your own intuitive quality of what you're making maybe, but it still is this thing that exists almost as like you love comics, you grew up wanting to make comics, and now you're able to make whatever comics you want. It's amazing, it's empowering, but I don't, like in my mind, I think of the Japanese fan fiction as well as being a huge inspiration of that, where it's like you can just make whatever you want now, and you're an example of proof that you can do that.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's the thing, like kind of what we started talking about was like, I was trying to play the game. I was trying to do all the right things, and it just wasn't working for me. So I just did this instead, and that served me really well. So I don't know, man, whatever works, people can't get mad at that, fuck them.
Yeah, straight up, man. I think that's a good place to leave it. But before we do that, let the people know once again when this Copra collection is coming out.
The Copra Master Collection is coming out November 16th from Image Comics. Every store should be able to get it. It's in the catalog. It's easily orderable.
We must be getting close to a final cutoff because those books take some time to construct, man. So yeah. I encourage everybody to go to your local comic shop, put in your orders and pre-orders right this moment, so that Image and Michel know how many of these fuckers to print up off the bat.
That's right.
Anything else you want to let people know about, man? Any show appearances, signings? How do they sign up for
the
Copra
latest
issues?
issue of Copra?
Well, you could just go to my website, michelfiffe.com, and all the information's there. You could go to the, it has links to the Etsy store where I sell issues and I sell merch, t-shirts and stuff. And I update news too for any store signings that nothing's been confirmed yet, but I do have some store signings coming up. And just on socials, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all over the place. Really just go to michelfiffe.com. It's all there. It's all there.
Super good. Anything you want to close on? All right, man, let's get the hell out of here and go read some comics.
Let's go, man.